Now that we've covered how to read, write, delete, and update the basic CRUD operations in SQLite, we're going to start to look at MongoDB. Now, MongoDB is not your traditional relational database. It acts a tad differently. We were thinking of entries or records as blobs inside of a file system, is one way to think about it. Now, in front of us right here, what we have is the MongoDB Cloud web interface, and we'll be using the GDAP 2020 project that I've already created. I'm going to dive into this. And for this to work, we need to create a cluster, and clusters are basically servers if we think about it. Right now we don't have any clusters built, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to first start by building a cluster. And we can select a bit of information of our preferred information. I'm just going to skip. And we're going to select the free cluster for us. I'm going to host this, either I can host it on Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud or Azure. And you can pick whichever one you'd like while generating one of these. For right now, I'm going to just take the Amazon Web Service located in the North Virginia. And we'll take that one there. And we're just going to keep everything in the free tier, which it will be a little bit slower when we are using it. However, we won't be billed for it. So let's create our cluster. And this will go off. It takes a few minutes for the cluster to be created. So once this is done, we'll come right back. Okay, now that our cluster has been created for us, what we'd like to do is take a little bit closer at what this has to offer. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to select the collections button here. And the collections are considered to be your databases, and inside of the collections you would have your tables, and your tables will have your blobs of data if we like to describe them. We'll click on add my own data, and we'll give this a database name. Our database name will be GDAP underscore 2020, and we'll add a collection name, and this collection name will be high scores. And that's the similar table name that we had in our previous example. Actually, we'll change that to be my game for the database name. This was the name of our database in the previous examples too. Okay, now that our database has been created and our table with high scores has been created, we can see we don't have any collections or documents inside of our table basic right now. And we'll create those inside of our C# application that we've been working with. It's important to note that Mongo doesn't use a traditional table. What they call it is documents, and documents are what you're adding into your high scores. So instead of a record, we're adding a document now, and we'll be getting a collection of documents and working with documents. And documents are what we can call a BISON, BSON, also known as a binary JSON file. Internally, it's all stored as binary data, but we can also just think of it as a JSON file at the end of the day. Now, to connect to the database, what we need to do is we need to go back to our clusters page, and we have the connect button here. And selecting the connect button will give us a list of options, and we're going to be connecting to our application through native drivers, and we'll be using the C# 2.5 or later. And I'm just going to copy this connection string for us to use later on, and we'll also have to grab the password, username and password eventually, and this information will be shared for us in the class. We'll discuss this about the usage of this username and this password specifically for any exercises that will be using the MongoDB, and what the repercussions are if this is abused. Okay, so we'll just close, and for now I'm going to just write this to just save this connection string somewhere for us for later on. Now that I have the connection string stored for later, we're going to jump back over into Visual Studio, and we'll set up Visual Studio for to use the MongoDB driver. Now in here, we'll need to use our NuGet package manager again. So we're selecting Tools, NU Package Manager, Manage NU Packages. We're going to browse, and we're going to browse specifically for MongoDB.driver. And we're just going to take the very first one, make sure that all our projects are selected, and click Install. We'll accept. And this will go ahead and add a handful of references to our project so that we can use the MongoDB. Now before we get into the next video, we want to set up one more thing. Mongo uses classes to represent data. So for our example here, what we're going to do is we're going to construct a class that represents the document that we would like to store. That's going to be a public class, high score. We're going to name that similar to what our database is. And then we're going to add 3 properties. First one is going to be a GUID. This is going to be our unique ID. We're going to be using GUIDs often inside of the game architecture course. So it's something to get familiar with right now. And GUIDs are very unique identifier numbers. We'll discuss them later on. We're now also going to create another property, which will be the string for the username. And then our final property will be the score. The only difference in our example here is that instead of using an integer for the primary key, we will be using a GUID. Another thing to note is MongoDB also provides an object ID, which is another way of using a unique identifier. And in this case, we're just going to use our GUID IDs, which is a non-MongoDB object for UIDs, just to demonstrate that you can use anything you'd like for a primary key as long as it's unique. Now to make sure that Mongo knows that this is a primary key, we also need to add the Bison ID attribute. That can be found in the MongoDB.bison.serialization.attributes. So we will have that included in our using namespace, and that will tell us that the ID is the primary key or the unique identifier for our high score objects. Now that we have MongoDB set up, we've done the web interface and we've done the project setup in Visual Studio, we can start to look at how do I read and update MongoDB in C# with .NET framework.